Hello, my name is Lisa Howell, and I'm a teacher and Canadian of Northern European descent.
Hello, my name is Nicola Whitehouse, and I too am an educator and a Canadian of Northern European descent. We are here today on the unceded lands of the Algonquin people at the Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa. Did you know that Beechwood is the National Cemetery of Canada?
We're so glad you've joined us. Today we'd like to teach you about 3 important people to help us learn more about our collective history. The first person we'd like to talk to you about is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. We're actually here at his grave, and you can see how well tended it is. You see many students, teachers, and other community members come to visit Dr. Bryce and to thank him for his service. He was the Chief Medical Officer with the Department of Indian Affairs about 115 years ago. In 1904, Dr. Bryce was asked to report on the health conditions in the Canadian residential school system in Western Canada and the Northwest Territories. What Dr. Bryce found at the 35 schools he visited was devastating and horrifying. Children at the schools were dying of tuberculosis, inadequate nutrition, lack of sanitation, and substandard medical care. Dr. Bryce reported that 24% of all students who had been at the schools were known to be dead. At the File Hills Reserve in Saskatchewan, 75% of the students had died in the first 16 years of the school's operation. We know that schools are places for learning and growth, not places for dying, and Dr. Bryce knew that too. Dr. Bryce went back to Ottawa and marched into the office of then Minister of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott. He told Mr. Scott what he had found, and he told Mr. Scott what needed to be done, namely, spend more money taking care of the schools and the students, better sanitation, ventilation, medical care, and nutrition. Although Dr. Bryce's report was shared widely within the Department of Indian Affairs, it was not shared publicly and was not acted upon. His report laid blame on the federal government for negligence that led to the shocking death rates due to communicable disease, primarily tuberculosis. Mr. Scott fired Dr. Bryce instead of listening to him. In 1922, Dr. Bryce published the report of his findings. He called it, very aptly, a national crime. Dr. Bryce is important for us to know about today. Many people say that nothing could be done because people didn't know about the conditions at residential schools. Dr. Bryce shows us that this is not true. He knew about it, he told the government about it, and he told them what to do about it. Yet they didn't listen. In 2015, Cindy Blackstock said, "Both Duncan Campbell Scott and Dr. Bryce were public servants. They were both people of faith, and they were confronted with the same problem. Duncan Campbell Scott chose loyalty to the organization, the federal government, and its purse. Bryce had the moral courage to stand up for the kids and take all the pushback that came with it. Bryce really confronts us with the reality that people knew then about the harms. They had a choice to make it different, and that there were people like him who spoke out." Unfortunately, the Government of Canada continues to underfund services for First Nations children on reserves. You can read more about the historic court case that has been going on for the past 14 years at fnCaringSociety.com. Now that you know about these harms, what will you do about it? Please join us in demanding that the federal government immediately stop all litigation against First Nations children and residential school survivors. Thank you.
Here we are at the grave of Duncan Campbell Scott, who until recently was known mainly for being one of Canada's Confederate Federation poets and celebrated for his contributions to Canadian poetry. However, this is not the whole story. Duncan Campbell Scott worked for the Department of Indian Affairs from 1879 to 1932 and was the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for 19 of those years. The impact that he had on the lives of thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, families, and communities was devastating.
As head of the Department of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott felt the role of residential schools was, quite simply, to speed up assimilation. He said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department."
As we learned about earlier, Scott was not interested in Dr. Bryce's suggestions, and in 1913 suspended funding of Bryce's research, suggesting that the cost of gathering statistics on child deaths far outweighed the benefits. Think about that. The cost of gathering information about children's deaths wasn't worth the money.
Duncan Campbell Scott is important to know about because his actions show us how normalized racisms can be if we don't speak up and speak out about them. We'd like you to now teach someone else what you have just learned about Duncan Campbell Scott. Once we know, we can't unknow.
There's one more person that we'd like to teach you about. His name was Nicholas Flood Davon. Have you heard of him? Probably not. Follow us, and we'll tell you all about him. Here we are at the resting site of Nicholas Flood Davon. Davon was originally from Ireland, but came to Canada in 1872 and later joined the Conservative Party. In 1878, the Canadian government sent him to the United States to investigate Indian education. His report, called the Davon Report, is what laid the groundwork for Indian residential schools in Canada. Davon wrote that as far as the adult Indian was concerned, little can be done with him. He can be taught to do a little at farming and at stock raising and to dress in a more civilized manner, but that is all. Davon believed residential schools where children would stay for the year were superior to day schools where children returned to their homes after a day's education and were still under, in his words, the influence of the wigwam. Residential schools, in his view, were the best option for Indians to be merged and lost within the nation. Can you imagine designing a school system for children to be lost? This is unthinkable. Davon's report was called Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds. Soon after his report, several government-sponsored residential schools opened. Because of his role and his report, Davon is considered one of the architects of the Canadian Indian residential school system. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has called the residential school system a cultural genocide.
We have learned about 3 very different men today. Their stories teach us that our beliefs about groups of people affect our actions towards those people. Duncan Campbell Scott and Nicholas Flood Davon believed that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people weren't worth the money and that the goal of the government was to get rid of the Indian problem. Dr. Bryce believed that all people deserved access to medical care, nutrition, sanitation, and prevention of disease. He knew this then, and we know this now.
Please be like Dr. Bryce. Take a stand. Write to your MP or to the Prime Minister and demand that they stop litigation against First Nations kids. Find out more on our website, fnkaringsociety.com, and click on the link below.
Thank you.